Understanding key positions, positional elements of the game, and building plan is no secret that is the most important part of the game for tacticians, for strategical players. Therefore, big part of the strategy, positional play, is created in the opening. And one of the main aspects of the positional play is weaknesses. So, what is weakness and how to take advantage of weaknesses? And a lot of people have a wrong understanding of the weaknesses. Whatever seems to be the weakness really is not, and sometimes they don't detect where is a weakness. So here I will try on this DVD to make some aspects of weaknesses cleared up and show you how to play against them. Well, let's randomly we're going to look at one position, one opening that I tried to recommend you. I recommended you on various DVDs. Bishop c4, knight f6. Now, but we are not going to look at the opening. We're going to look at the position after opening, what weaknesses is, and how do we play it? How do we play around these weaknesses, and how do we take advantage of it? Bishop c4, knight f6, e5, d5, bishop b5, knight e4, knight takes d4, bishop d7, bishop takes c6, pawn takes c6. We are not gonna make big stops in the opening and analyze it, because what I wanna show you is one specific type of positions. Knight d2, knight takes d2, queen takes d2, bishop b6, and knight b3. Now, here I will be talking to you about weaknesses, how to take advantage of it, and what really weaknesses are. Weaknesses are not necessarily some pawn or some piece of your opponent is very weak. In this case, we have weaknesses on the c5 and d4 squares. So how do we take advantage of it? Now, we just played knight b3, and we want to blockade c5 and d4 squares if it's possible. Now, how do we do that? Black will try to prevent it. Queen e7. We want to put some piece on c5 square, which we cannot do at the moment. We're playing queen c3. Now, suppose our opponent plays f6. And here comes the first test. What do we put on c5? The knight or the bishop? And these are the key. Now we're going to talk about key elements of the strategy of taking advantage of weaknesses and key strategy of blockade. Blockade and weakness goes hand to hand. So suppose we are thinking, a lot of people think like this, and it's a big mistake, that when we put knight c5 or bishop c5, our opponent is going to take. Well, if we know that our opponent is taking on c5, we definitely play bishop c5. And because now we have dominating piece, which is a knight, against light square bishop, then later you're going to support knight with b4, and that's the taking advantage of the position. And we're going to talk later how to take advantage of this, how to bring it to the win. However, in this position, bishop c5 is a wrong move. It's not correct. The reason is why, because black will not take on c5. Black will go simply maybe rook e8. Notice that queen is not hanging because white's king is exposed. So, and suppose you move the king and now black plays queen e6. Now, I gotta tell you here, either that way or black can play f takes c, f takes e, and then even play queen g5. You see, it's very, very difficult for white to maintain this blockade. Now you need a queen and knight supporting the bishop on c5. And interestingly enough, that black will never take this bishop on c5. They may go rook f5 later, and then you will see that knight on b3 has to be supporting this bishop on c5, and that's not a right idea. If we had wishful thinking, if you have wishful thinking, you will definitely play bishop c5, somehow assuming that it's mandatory for black to take the bishop. But black obviously will not. The correct move here is knight c5. And again, there may be wrong thinking on white's part. Oh, I don't want to play knight c5 because eventually, not at the moment, eventually after fe, black will take the knight on c5 and we're going to have opposite color bishops and a draw. This is wrong thinking for two reasons. First of all, even if we get up after we get opposite color bishops, it's better than having your pieces tied up like this and you don't know what to do with the knight. Secondly, you should not be afraid of opposite color bishops, because those positions with opposite color bishops are with a big advantage for white. And the reason, suppose the pieces exchanged and black takes on c5. Just to let you understand why is this opposite color bishop position is very far away from a draw. There's few elements of this position that you have to understand. First of all, we have queens on the board. And it's known we have the F file controlled with the rook. And it's known that when you have an attack on your opponent's king or on any side of the board, it's better to have opposite color bishops because your opponent cannot control squares that are attacked by your bishop. Your opponent's bishop cannot control the square. This position is very bad for black if not lost. Suppose black goes queen e6. Well, not to mention something else, there is a pawn which is very weak on a7, and white can play simply, just to give you some example of this position. White can play simply queen to f3, create threats, or maybe queen to g3, creating threat of rook f6, and black's rook cannot move because a7 pawn is hanging. So even if they play a6, when rook moves later, a6 pawn will be a target. Not to mention this, there is a possibility of direct successful attack after rook f6. I think white simply wins, because on queen e8 there is rook f8 check, and on queen g4 now it's okay even to exchange queens, because white is going to win several pawns. So you have, first of all, if you think that opposite color bishops always a draw, you have to reassess your opinion. First, when queen's on the board, it may be even better that you have an opposite color bishops. Secondly, not all end games are drawn with opposite color bishops, especially if rooks are on the board. And this position very far from a draw. White has big positional advantage. Not to mention, now if you think about it, white is practically a pawn up, because you see the double pawns on c file totally worthless. And white has control of squares on a queen side, even on the king side, thanks to bishop on c5 controlling the f8 square. So this position is not good. It's a very bad position. Now going back to the position where we played knight c5. Now this is very important to understand. Very important to understand. When we played knight c5, what is the best thing black can do? Well, black can play bishop f5. Now their bishop possibly will be placed on e4. Well, okay, we have to go rook a1 to e1 or bishop d4. And after exchanging pawns, black eventually, they may play rook f7, and we may go b4 to support the knight, because you want to move the queen. So this is weaknesses on c5 square and d4 square allowed white to make a full board control on a full time control on dark squares. And now even if black takes on c5, white takes and black goes queen e6. You see, this is a little bit different from what we just looked with opposite color bishops, but concept is the same. Because it's a little different because black is eventually going to put bishop on e4. Bishop on e4 stands very well. Yeah, that's true, but again, the weakness on a7, possibility of getting f-file for white, and black is disabled to contest to challenge white on f-file because of the f8 square. That makes white's position much better. So there is nothing that can be done by black. For example, after bishop e4, we take on f7, queen is going to take, we're going to go rook f1, queen e6. Bishop stands better on e4, but evaluation doesn't change. White has clear advantage. We're going to go queen g3 with the same rook f6 idea, and then we may go h4, h5. It's hard to well, if you're afraid of giving c2 pawn, you have time to go rook f2, protecting, and then queen g3. It's very hard to compare bishop on c5 and bishop on e4. They look like, this is very important to understand, they look like both very well placed bishops. Let me tell you the significant difference in this position that you can better understand concept of this position. Yeah, both bishops are very well placed, that's true, but white has to play. White has a plan of pressuring king side by using this bishop, by using this c5 bishop. And if queens exchanged in future, white has possibility of activating the e pawn. And the most important thing, that black's bishop very well placed on e4. but there is nothing to go with it. So when you have some piece placed in the middle of the board, dominating position, you have to create some kind of a play where this piece can be used. Bishop on e4 is very well placed, but black has nothing to go with it. What this bishop can do by itself, it's nothing. All you can do is take a picture of this bishop and say, oh, I had a very good bishop. Yeah, it is good bishop, but absolutely in this position it's useless. If black could penetrate with his pieces and create attack, then this bishop can be used. But you see, white's bishop is used 100%. And white can go queen f4, they can go h4, h5, they can go rook f6. And if queen moves, e-pawn may be activated. It's a big advantage. You have to understand, when you have the blockade, what has to go with it. Well, if we take queens off the board and rooks off the board, what do we have? We have a blockade, same everything, except we have no play. We have no play, no plan, and nothing to go with it. So blockade by itself means nothing if you don't create a play around it. So what you need, without queens and rooks, obviously, you have nothing. So in that position, you cannot exchange queens and rooks. And frankly, there is no way how black can even attempt to exchange pieces. Well, they sure can attempt to exchange queens like this. But if they exchange queens, here is what is going to happen. Bishop takes, and e6 followed by e7 gives black very difficult position. Suppose black goes h6 and after e7 rook e8, rook f8 check, and king h7. This position is absolutely lost for black. What white can just do, because black is totally paralyzed, white can just come with the king to a5 square. Well, you say it's a fantasy? No, it's very possible, and it's very easy, because there are no moves black can do to relieve the pressure. To relieve the pressure, that means the king will never come out anywhere. So you just go march king f2, d2, e3, and dark squares, and penetrate to a5 and take all the black pawns. So this is how you use opposite color bishops. Actually, they teaches you a little bit about opposite color bishops, that they are not always a draw. And most important, all this was possible because of black's weaknesses on dark squares. Now imagine pawn was on b6. We could never go bishop d4, and black will play rook e8. Even in the middle game, it's totally equal position. But here, white has control of all squares, and that's why we got totally winning position. Now, let's go once more, and I gotta show you something else that is very interesting about this blockading position. This blockading position can be, we can get various different ways. And the reason why I recommend this opening to most of my students, I don't play this very often, but the reason why I recommend to play this opening, because by playing this opening, it's not necessarily you're going to get better positions if black plays correct all the way. You're not necessarily going to get better position than in any other opening. But what is important here, that you're gonna learn a lot about the strategy of blockading of weak squares, and by playing opening and learning opening, you learn a lot about the game of chess. Well, now let me show you this. Bishop c5. There's another variation, bishop e3, bishop takes d4. Those are best moves for white. And I don't want to stop and analyzing why this move, why that move, because we're not analyzing the opening. Castle, bishop takes c6, pawn takes c6, knight c3, bishop f5, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, and castle. Now, we got similar type of position. But let me tell you difference. This is also blockade. All the same aspects of strategy apply. Well, it's not good for black to take the c2 pawn, because after rook c1 and rook takes c6, all black pawns are weak. So we are not going to make deliberately bad moves for black. But let's suppose black plays queen d7. Now the pawn is hanging. We will go c3. Black will go, I don't know, maybe rook e8. How do we play this position? We have control on c5 square. What we don't have, and we had in the other position, that we had pawns off the board and bishop on c5, which gives us great chances to attack on king side. This is different type of position. How do we play? Now, we have to make our bishop better than black's bishop, which means we have to create outpost for our bishop without giving black bishop an outpost. For example, I would say mistake here to go f4. It's a serious positional mistake. The reason why, because now black's bishop has permanent outpost on e4, and it's going to be very difficult for us to go f5. So it's very difficult for white to make a progress. Correct way to play. We will go f3. Bishop will move to g6. Now we could go rook d1. Make sure your opponent doesn't go c5. And if you take on e5. So what we do, I want to play here rook d1. And here is my plan. Eventually, I want to put my bishop on f2, rook on e1, and make sure, you see, this is slow developing position. Now what you're going to do is slowly take all the space on the board. Control completely whole board. You're going to put double rooks on e file. You make sure black will never play c5. You can even go b4 and a3 to totally blockade everything. Where do you have to win this game? You have to win it on the king side. The way to do it, after you totally blockaded black's c pawn, now you're gonna go g4. You see, you're gonna go g4, but black's g pawn, white's g pawn, will not go any farther than that. Then you're gonna go king g2. Well, I assume black by then puts the rooks on e file, and then you're gonna go either bishop h4 or put the bishop on g3 and try to go h4 h5. Do not provide for black's light square bishop any outpost. That means do not play f4 and let bishop go to e4. So we played g4 and f3, accordingly controlling f5 and e4 squares, which will totally disable this bishop. Now c2 and b1 squares, there is nothing happening on queen side that it will be imperative for bishop to stay on g6. And eventually you want to prepare h4, h5. And that will give you big chances to win. For example, you can go bishop h4. Here is the way to win this particular position. Well, I just told you, do not play f4. Okay, now I'm going to violate the same rule. Because the reason I'm going to violate this rule, because it's concrete reason. I'm going to go bishop h4, force black to go rook e6, and now I'm going to go f4 with the idea of going f5, because bishop e4 doesn't work, because rook takes e4 and queen is hanging. So as an idea, I will tell you, do not play f4. But when opportunity is right, everything I said can be reversed. Anything I said can be reversed. But as a general plan, you put bishop pawns on f3, g4, put your pieces in the best position, and ready for action, you're going to go h4 and create strong attack against your opponent's king. So you see now, white is totally dominating in the center. Black does not have any outposts. Now, the other way this position may be played is queen can be put on f4 or d2. Bishop can be put on f2 and c5. This way, when rook goes to e6, we're going to come back with the queen on d4. So you can put bishop on c5, you can put bishop on g3. They are both very good ideas. And eventually you're going to go h4, h5 or f4, f5 without giving e4 squares for black. This is how you take advantage of this very delicate position where you have weaknesses. Weaknesses on d4 and c5. They don't necessarily mean that you're going to penetrate there with your king, which is possible in some cases. You know, for example, in this position. How do you win this position? A lot of times I had this question asked. Here is the typical position that may come out from this opening. How do you win this position? Well, here, the same weaknesses of dark squares can be taken advantage of because you're just going to win all these pawns. How do you win all these pawns? And here, how do you win? Assuming you can get this position, how is this position winning? Well, that's what we're going to accomplish. Our king on d4, opponent's king on d6. But now, where are we going from here? What is the plan to win? You are not going to play c4 here or try to win on a queen side. You win on the queen side by playing on the king side. The way you do it, you go g4. Well, assuming black's bishop is on f7 because bishop on c8 stands very badly. Now, any pawn endgame. Well, we have here dominating knight and very poor bishop. Question. Do we exchange knight for bishop? On one hand, you can say, well, that's a big mistake because the knight is much better than the bishop. Why should we exchange? Well, that sounds very logical, but knight takes bishop is instantly winning move. We have to learn one thing. There are the good knight against bad bishop. why why it's so important to know all the advantages of it, because at some point you can exchange this knight, this strong piece for weak piece, to redeem for material advantage. It's like now, by taking the bishop, white simply wins because white goes king c5. Eventually, both sides ran out of moves with pawns. King has to move, and white takes all black's pawns on the queen side. Well, but suppose this is not possible, and bishop is on f7. How do we win this position? This position we win very simply. We will push our pawns. Suppose black goes like this, and black is waiting. Now, what we do here? There are several ways actually to win in this position. You can go knight check, and after king moves, you can go king c5, and then come back with knight on a5, and just take all black's pawns. The other way to win is to create pass pawn. And now you can bring your knight to a strong position on f4, go f6, and then you can bring the knight to d3 and e5 and push f7. Eventually, what is going to happen, black's king has to go to stop the pawn, and then you penetrate with a king and taking all the pawns on the queen side. Well, this is the easiest, this is the best position white can get if they can exchange all pieces and get knight versus bishop in this type of pawn structure, and have dominating knight against bad bishop. Actually, this is going to be this kind of great help for people who play Scotch Gambit, the opening it comes out of, but it also should be very instructive for every chess player to see how do you take advantage of weak squares in general. So the main aspects are create a play to make sure that this blockading weak dark squares you will benefit from. That goes from the middle game positions we just looked, where we had queen and two rooks and opposite color bishops. And opposite color bishops, as you just saw, doesn't always mean that position is simple and drawish. This position is big advantage for white, and this position is big advantage for white. So what seems to be a very simple and quiet position, in fact, is very bad position for black. And a lot of people, when they play, I've seen it when I've played some games, some people having this kind of a bad position for black would offer me a draw here with black. And not because they are rude, no, not at all, because they think it's drawish position and it's equal. And only much later in a game, close to the end of the game or after the game, they realize, yes, the position was bad. Well, so before you get in there, for white or for black, you should know, for black, you try to stay away from this kind of positions. And for white, once you get this position, you would know how to capitalize on them. We just saw a classical example of playing on weak squares. Let me give you little similarity, show you a couple of similar positions with the same idea, with the same aspect. For example, let's go the position of a Tarrasch variation. So It's a queen's gambit. Very, very well-known positions. And this is all theory. CD, knight takes d4, h6, and bishop e3. Now, what is different here? We don't have same kind of a weak squares. We have weak pawn. And how to play against the weak pawn is this is isolated pawn, and it's one of the most difficult aspects of the strategy when the isolated pawn is a weakness and when it's a strength. In this position, I gotta tell you, what are the weak sides of having isolated pawn? What's the bad news for the black? Here, the pawn is weak, obviously can be attacked, and also white gets an outpost on d4. Well, on the other hand, the pawn on d5 creates a lot of landing squares on c4, on e4 and c4 for black's pieces, and gives them kind of free game and some space. Well, we are not going to be discussing this now, but what I want to tell you about weak squares. So suppose black goes rook e8, and the type of position I want to discuss, type of position, which is very similar to the ones we just looked at. There were also the same similar d4 and c5 squares. What is the right way to play these positions for white? We are not going to go through this game and how to play this particular position. I'm telling you how to play positions where you have blockade, possible blockade on d4 and c5 squares. So the good thing to do for white is to exchange dark squared bishop, because that makes black's dark squares more vulnerable. Now bishop takes, knight takes, and then ideal would be to play e3 and queen d4. That's what you're aiming for. And you see, this is two completely different openings. Scotch gambit and queen's gambit declined. But strategy is strategy. Logic is a logic in chess. And this is the right way to play. Then eventually you want to put pressure on black's c-pawn, exchange some pieces, and capitalize against these weaknesses. So this type of positions we learned from Scotch. That's why I'm recommending to play Scotch, because you learn a lot about the main strategy. Now let's talk a little bit about isolated pawns. Isolated pawns can be created, as I just showed you, from Scotch, from Queen's Gambit declined, or we can have it in Caro-Kann even, ED, CD, C4, and eventually we get this kind of pawn structure. That's an isolated pawn. So you can get it in French. For example, knight d2, c5, ed, ed, and eventually we're going to get this position with isolated pawn. It's very important to understand how to play them. Now, I want to show you a game that was played between Anatoly Karpov and Rafael Vaganyan, also a very strong grandmaster. Game was played in 1976. Even though it was 32 years ago, the strategy and positional understanding of the chess did not change much. The game, well, I will show you that when you, let me get the position, e4, e6, d4, d5, knight d2, c5, e takes d, e takes d, knight f3, a6. We are not gonna be talking about opening much. Bishop takes c5, knight b3, bishop b6, bishop d3, knight e7, castle, knight bc6, rook e1, bishop g4, c3, h6, h3, bishop h5. Okay, let's talk about this position. This is very interesting position. The white has square on d4, possibly, and black has weak pawn. But you see, the game that was won by white was not won because they won this pawn and they won the game. They sometimes you can transfer the pawn structure advantage into different kind, and this is very instructive to follow. Obviously, white wants to exchange dark square bishops to get control on d4 square. So bishop e3 was played, black castled, white took on b6, and queen takes b6. Queen to e2, rook f2 d8. You can tell that d5 pawn does not look like weak. It's isolated, but it's not weak. Rook a2 d1, and a5 was played by the black. Here we have to notice something. Black is very well defending d5 pawn, and white has problems putting knight on d4 because of pin of this knight. Black simply can't take. So what white should do? Black's pieces are not placed very well, and black's king is having some problems. Bishop b1, very strong move. And after bishop b1, white has an advantage. Now, why? We're going to discuss this now. Now, after this move, what can black do? White has an idea of penetrating on the king side. Maybe black should have played a4, but then white would go knight d4, and after knight takes d4, rook takes d4. So black got a clever idea, clever as they thought, to take on f3. White's plan is simply to continue blocking d4 square, and at some point maybe have idea of bringing queen to h7. But queen d3 at this point is not going to work because of bishop g6. Bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, and a4. Very, very dangerous way to play for black, because now queen d3 idea may be very real. And in this position, after taking on f3 and playing a4, white has to decide to play queen d3 or not. On queen d3, it's not clear white can get much, because AB, queen h7, king f8, and this position, even after bishop h7, is not clear, because what can white do after knight e7? So what happened here, after white played a4 in this position, black played a4, white went knight d4, and queen takes b2. Now white totally removes this knight on e7 by playing knight takes c6. Now this knight is hanging. Knight takes c6 and queen f5. All of a sudden, you see white stopped playing against weak pawn. White stopped playing against to play for d4 square. So white goes for attack because blacks, if you can notice, all black's pieces on the left side of the board, and king needs a lot of attention. Bishop and queen aiming on the king side plus two rooks are ready for action. After queen f5, I think black is lost. g6, queen f6. Now it's obvious threat of bishop takes g6 forces black to play rook d7. Bishop takes g6 would have been okay here, but Karpov found a lot more interesting move and a lot stronger move. Bishop to f5. Bishop to f5 is a very powerful move that creates deadly threats. On g takes f, for example, either queen takes f5 with the idea rook d3, g3, or rook d3 right away will give black no hope for defense. f4, maybe queen takes f4, or queen takes h6, queen takes f4 with idea rook g3. Black is totally hopeless because of all the queens, all the pieces are on queen side. So after bishop f5, so it's not much left in a game to play. Bishop f5 attacking rook. So what can black do? Black played rook e7, rook takes e7, knight takes e7, and now they simply remove the bishop. Knight is still hanging, and bishop takes g6 is threatening. Black is totally lost. We don't have to go much farther. Knight f5, bishop takes f5, pawn takes f5, simply rook e1 with rook e7. And I don't want to go through the end of the game to the end of the game because it's not as important. You saw how white, at some point, they derailed. They forgot about playing against the pawn and started kingside attack because of piece superiority. Actually, this example kind of integrates between piece coordination and playing on weaknesses. And white started with playing on black's weakness on d5, and when black got overly ambitious, they abandoned the king side, and disaster followed right after. Now, the other game I want to show you also played by Anatoly Karpov. It's a lot more instructive to playing strictly on weaknesses, and it was very, very well played. This is actually one of the most instructive games playing on weaknesses I have seen. e4, c5. Karpov is playing white. Game also played in over 20 years ago between Anatoly Karpov and Bent Larsen. Knight f3, knight c6, Sicilian d4, cd, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, d6, bishop g5, e6, queen d2, bishop e7, white castled, black castled. f4, h6, bishop h4, e5. Now, this is very well known theoretical position, and according to theory, best move is knight f5, but Karpov played simply knight takes c6, pawn takes c6, f takes e, d takes e, queen takes d8, rook takes d8, rook takes d8, bishop takes d8. And now bishop c4. Now let's talk about this position. What are the weaknesses? At this point, black's weaknesses are black's pieces. Black doesn't have good place to put this bishop. Bishop g4 is only temporary. Bishop on e7 is okay, but white will go rook d1 eventually. Black made a decision to play bishop e6 to create some weaknesses, but at least they have king coming out soon. White has weakness on e4. It's not necessarily a terrible mistake, but it is a mistake. So bishop takes e6, fe, and now we will see how Karpov, those are weaknesses that came out practically right after the opening. Now Karpov takes advantage of these weaknesses. These weaknesses, they don't mean that you can immediately win these pawns. No, pawn weaknesses, and you see how beautifully pieces maneuver to get dominating positions, white's pieces, dominating positions to attack these weaknesses. Bishop g3, bishop c7, king d2, actually rook d1 and king f7, king d2, king e7, king e2, and knight to d7. It looks like white cannot get even close to black's pawns, and that's true. That's the way it is. But what should we do here? What is a good positional player would do here, keeping in mind black's pawn structure? Now, here is the way. This is very instructive endgame. Here is the way you should think. Let's take knight on c3 off the board for a minute, and you keep your knight in your hand and say, what will be the best position for the knight? You will not say knight on b6 because I take the rook on a8. Well, I'm talking about realistic position. The best position for white's knight is on c4. You see, because of the pawn structure, you see, black does not have b pawn to attack and to derail white's knight, and they don't have d pawn to chase knight away. So knight on c4 will be attacking on e5, and together with the bishop and knight, they may paralyze black's bishop and knight. So that's where knight is heading to. Knight b1. Knight b1 was played. Very strong move. Knight b6. Now simply b3, preventing black's knight to go anywhere. g5, knight d2. You see knight heading to c4, but of course white is not gonna play knight c4 when black can just take on c4. Knight d2, rook g8, and here comes the plan which allows white to put knight on c4. a4, intending a5 and put the knight on c4. After a4, black played knight d7, well, because they will be pushed a5 anyway. Knight c4, h5, a5, stopping black from coming back to b6, and knight to c5, attacking e4 pawn. Now, after attacking e4 pawn, white is forced. Black played knight e5 not because it's knight c5, not because it's good, because they realized they already lost. If h4, then we can simply go bishop f2. There is another weakness, and on a6, I don't know, maybe bishop b6, trying to exchange these bishops, and you see white is totally dominating here. Larsen is not the kind of player that likes passive defense, so he played knight c5, and after bishop takes e5, black totally fell apart. Bishop takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e4, knight takes c6, king f6. Now you have to stop this fork, king e3, and knight c3, rook f1. And this is totally hopeless, and in a few moves, white simply won the game. Very well played, very simple, very well, and very instructive. If it was very difficult to do, it wouldn't have been that instructive. Actually, game was not difficult, but was very consistently played, and very nice game and very instructive. So let's go to the next game. There is one more game I wanted to show you, which have also played by Karpov, and this game is played against Eugene Torre, Filipino Grandmaster. This was played in 1987, also about 20 years ago. And the game started where black had no weaknesses. Only weakness black had in this game was the space in beginning. And you see how it slowly went to the big positional advantage, and black had to, sometimes your opponent has no weaknesses, but position is bad and they voluntarily create weaknesses. Well, this is a good example of it. e4, d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, bishop e2, castle, castle, c5, d5, knight a6, h3, knight c7, a4, b6, rook e1, bishop b7, bishop c4, a6, queen d3. And here we have position where black is cramped. This game is very similar, this position, to the position was played in a first match between Korchnoi and Karpov, where I was Korchnoi second, the last game of the match, where Karpov never gave black chance to play b5. And this is the same type of position, but in this position, black voluntarily played e6, trying to give their open position and give some play for their locked pieces. e6, d takes e, knight takes e6. Now white develops pieces. Now it's interesting how next move is actually, I admire next move very much. It's one of the simplest moves you can make, one of the most primitive moves, but made by Anatoly Karpov, it makes it very instructive. Okay, I would normally, if I saw some weak player played this move, I would be very skeptical at first. But the move was made here was bishop d2. Now, why this move is so strong and so powerful? Well, we have to get on the bottom of it. Obviously, white needs to put the rook on d1. Just to make it legally, bishop has to move. Bishop does not go to e3, where e4 pawn may be a target at some point after rook e8. White does not want to play bishop g5 because knight simply will take on g5. But white may try to go knight d5 and try to eliminate this knight and later put the bishop on f4. No. Karpov calculated that after bishop d4, bishop d2, queen c7, he will put rook on d1, rook fd8, and then retrieve the bishop or put the knight on d5 and maintain blockade. Bishop on d2 is not very comfortable, but he calculated exactly that it will be good enough to keep pawn on d6 as a weak pawn. Knight d5, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, bishop takes d5, and queen takes d5. Very well planned. Now all white wants to do is to play bishop c1, and black is going to have grave weakness on d6. Bishop takes b2 is of course bad move because of c3, and bishop is in a lot of trouble. So that's what white wants to do, bishop c1 or even pawn c3, stopping knight d4. That's why black played in this position knight d4. And after white played knight takes d4, black played c takes d4. Now, black has now two weak pawns, but it was well played by black so far, because at least they have some kind of a weakness white has on c2 that white has to deal with. Rook c1, rook ac8, and pawn to c4. Now, black is absolutely forced to take en passant, because if they don't, bishop is going to go to f4 or b4, and eventually every pawn is weak. So d takes c was played, bishop takes c3, bishop takes c3, rook takes c3, queen d7. And now you see that pawn on d6 still weak. It's one weakness black has, and limited number of pieces, and that's the strongest part of Karpov's game. Rook takes c8. We see how he won this position. Rook takes c8, and now e5. Of course, after queen takes a4, white has two ways to get decisive advantage. One is simply ed and pushing for d7, and the second one is e6. So black did not do it. Black played rook c5 and queen d3. Now the pawn is still hanging. Queen e6, queen takes a6, and rook takes c5, and rook takes c5. Here, Tore made a terrible mistake. He took with the queen, and after queen takes b6, he simply lost in a few moves. But even if he played correct move, which is de, he didn't do it not because he didn't see it. Of course he saw it, but because white can play queen b7 with the idea b4 and a5, and its still position is very, very difficult for black. Not to mention, they also can try to go a5 here, and after b takes a, queen takes a5, the pass pawns also creates a lot of problems for black. I'm not saying it doesn't matter this is winning or not, but this is big advantage for white, and that's the way it should have been played. But we see how well it was played by white against one weakness on d6. There are countless positions and openings where one side or another gets weaknesses. And we cannot obviously go through all of them, but there is a way, there are some criterias which you should use for determining whether this weakness you have is grave weakness that is very difficult to defend, or you have enough counterplay for this weakness, or it's not that important, it's not that critical. And some of these weaknesses may be created by one side or another voluntarily. For example, as pawn of attack in Caro-Kann. You see, when this happens, knight c3, e6, knight f3, bishop e7, cd, knight takes d5. White voluntarily creates d4 weakness, but they do it to get active piece play and attack on the king side. Now, we are not going to discuss this subject because this is huge subject, and how to play Caro-Kann, how to play pawn of attack at positions with isolated pawns. This is like a whole school about it. And not even top players in the world can play these positions perfectly. But those are voluntarily created weakness. Now, there are some weaknesses that you create for your opponent using some combination and tactics. For example, let me show you one quick example how white uses strong tactics to get to create weaknesses for opponent. Knight f3, d5. Now this is frequently played opening. h3, knight f6. Well, one of the moves is d takes e, and the other one is knight f6. e5, knight e4. And white can play bishop d3. And but there is a move, knight takes e4. d takes e, knight g5, c5. No, white simply wants to win the e4 pawn, and on bishop f5, g4. And white gets the e4 pawn. So c5, d takes c, and black gets this pawn. Queen a5 check, bishop d2, queen takes c5, and bishop c3. And here looks like neither side has weaknesses. Bishop takes e5, and black is expecting knight takes e4. However, this position is already terrible for black because they don't lose any material, but they get some terrible weaknesses which they normally cannot overcome. The simple combination, bishop takes e5, queen takes e5, and queen to d8 check. King takes d8, knight f7 check, and after king e8 or king c7, knight takes e5, and you see it's total material equality, but there is no need to tell you that these pawns are extremely weak, and position is very bad for black. Therefore, this is very bad position. Now, another thing, it's also white just used tactical shot to get this position. And actually, let me show you the similar. Well, not the similar, as an idea. In same Scotch gambit, in the Scotch gambit, d4, ed, bishop c4, knight f6, e5, d5, bishop b5, knight e4, knight takes d4, bishop c5, we go bishop e3, and on bishop d7, we go bishop takes c6, b takes c. Now, where is tactic here? Knight d2, knight takes d2, queen takes d2. In this position, actually, you should know that we want to do knight b3, bishop b6, and queen c3. We talked about it. However, black can try to play differently. Instead of knight takes d2, they may go queen e7. And here we again using tactical shots to get a position with a lot of weaknesses for black. We play knight takes e4, pawn takes e4, and here is the tactical shot, e6. Now we guaranteed position with big advantage. And here sometimes combination is made tactics to get mating attack, to win a rook, to win a knight, and here to make weaknesses. Those are the most difficult type of combinations, because besides playing the combination, you have to assess the final position. If you win a rook, it doesn't take much of a skill to assess, though if I have an extra rook, well, that should be a good combination. But when you create weaknesses, you have to correctly assess that my opponent is going to have enough weaknesses in order for me to win the game. So this position after e6 is pretty bad for black. Bishop takes e6, interestingly enough, loses a piece after knight takes e6. And you see f takes c is not possible, f takes c, because of queen h5 check, followed by queen takes c5. And so after knight takes e6, bishop takes e3. White simply wins a piece after knight f5. And bishop takes f2, king takes f2, queen c5, simply knight e3. So this is not possible, but what is the best way to play for black after e6 move? In this position, when we took on e4 and played e6, this is position. The best way is to play f takes e. But then we play knight takes c6, attacking the queen. Now there is bishop b4 check, also gives white big advantage. After knight takes b4 and queen d2. But on bishop takes c6, queen h5 check, g6, queen takes c5, queen takes c5, bishop takes c5. Very, very difficult position for black, maybe lost. You see, black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawn islands. White has only 2. Pawn on e4 is weak, so white's plan is to go king e2 and king e3, where king will be ideally placed, and black has too many weaknesses. We don't want to go into details how to play these positions, but it's a huge advantage for white. So white played this. By the way, e3 is not good either, because white will simply play f3 and win the e3 pawn. So we went through this combination, these tactical shots we use to get a lot of weaknesses for black. Now we have great position. Let me show you one more, and I think it's very instructive example. It's the opening I used to play. No, theoretically, it's known as not very good for black, but nobody has proved it. Nobody has really proved it clearly that it's not good because of this and this and that. And white has big advantage. They just say it's not good, but I'm not convinced. Here is the opening. It's regular Sicilian defense. Knight c6, d4, cd, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, d6, bishop g5. It's a Richter-Rauser attack, very well-known position, million times was played, and g6 move. They say it's not good because bishop takes f6, ef, and there is a weakness on d5, weak pawn on d6, and white has big advantage. Well, this position is very different from any positions that you can see with isolated pawn. And here is why. Actually, it's very instructive to see why. When white goes bishop e2 or bishop c4, black does not hang on to d6 pawn. Black just gives it up. And on castle, we castle, and on knight b5, we just give up the pawn and open the bishops. And some position like this, we may have very active counterplay against the weakness. In exchange for a weakness. So this is voluntarily created weakness in exchange for dynamics of our pieces. If you are interested, you can dig into database for positions with this opening. But this is not necessary. White cannot play this position very positionally. They cannot, for example, go knight b3 on f5, just take, and clearly blockade this pawn and win it later. No, because black has pair of very active bishops, and they're gonna have very active play. So they have positional justification for this weakness. And that's the way we have to look at it. Now, of course, it's going to be close battle which one prevails, the activity of the pieces of the playing for weaknesses. But that's what the weaknesses are. Understanding weaknesses are one of the most important and difficult parts of the strategy. Although some positions are very clear cut. So you get these weaknesses and you see there is no compensation from the other side, so you keep pressing on them. That's easy. Some positions create difficulties. So this is very hard and wide subject, so I just provide you some kind of a material to analyze, to think about, to explore, and to learn more about weaknesses created in the middle game or in the opening. Good luck, and you're gonna learn a lot by studying these positions.